August 2nd, 1943. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. 2:15 hours. On one side of the naval ledger, you have the Imperial Japanese Navy's Tokyo Express. 6 Kajero and Asatio-class destroyers. 12,000 tons of reinforced steel. 36 5-inch guns, capable of obliterating a target from 10 miles away. Each ship is powered by twin-shaft geared turbines, generating 30,000 horsepower, pushing these 2,000-ton predators through the water at 35 knots. They are the apex predators of the night, shielded by 5 inches of hardened belt armor. Against them stands a single American PT boat, 45 tons of plywood and mahogany. Its armor thickness, exactly 1 inch of wood. Its primary armament, for Mark 8 torpedoes. Weapons notorious for mechanical unreliability. Its total displacement is 260 times smaller than the force it is about to engage. In the cold calculus of naval warfare, this isn't a battle. It is a rounding error. It is a mathematical impossibility. At 2:17, Lieutenant Commander John Wildman Harlen looked at the green phosphor glow of the primitive radar screen. The blips were massive, moving in a tight staggered column. The manual for patrol torpedo boats was clear. Fire from 1,000 yards, turn, and use your wake to disappear into the darkness. But Harlen's torpedoes were already dead in the water. 2 had failed to launch, their cold start mechanisms seizing in the salt air. The other 2 had hit the lead destroyer's hull with a hollow metallic thud-duds. The ledger of the Pacific War now looked like a death sentence. 45 tons of wood was trapped in a 360-degree kill zone, surrounded by 18,000 combined horsepower and the concentrated fury of the Japanese fleet. The manual suggested one final course of action: scuttle the ship and evade. Harlen looked at the lead destroyer, a Kajero-class monster looming out of the mist, and chose a different calculation. If he couldn't sink them with a blast, he would break them with momentum. He didn't just order a retreat, he ordered the mufflers bypassed and the safety governors stripped off the throttles. He was about to turn a reconnaissance boat into a 45-ton kinetic bullet. To understand how a piece of plywood survives a collision with a mountain of steel, you have to understand the environment of the Solomon Islands in 1943. This was the slot, a graveyard of ships where the humid air was so thick it muffled the sound of engines until it was too late. The United States was struggling to hold the line at Guadalcanal, and the PT boats were the thin, splintering line of defense against the Japanese supply runs, known as the Tokyo Express. The PT boat was never intended for surfacey slugging matches. An Elco 80-foot boat was essentially a hollow shell built for speed. It was powered by 3 Packard 4 M2500V12 engines. These were liquid-cooled supercharged monsters, each displacing 2,500 cubic inches. Running on 100-octane aviation fuel, these engines were rated for 1,350 horsepower each. They were engineering masterpieces, but they were temperamental. They were designed to run at 2,400 RPM for short bursts. Lieutenant Commander John Harlen was not a man for short bursts, known as Wildman by his crew and a liability by his superiors. Harlen was 32 years old, with a degree in mechanical engineering and a complete disregard for the structural limits of mahogany. He knew that the 1-inch planking of his hull was held together by thousands of bronze screws and glue-impregnated canvas. It was flexible, it was light, and at high speeds, physics changed the nature of the material. The Japanese destroyers they were facing were the pinnacle of naval design. The Kajero class was built to destroy cruisers. They carried the Type 93 long lance torpedo, a weapon that used pure oxygen to travel further and faster than anything in the American arsenal. Their crews were the best-trained night fighters in the world, using high-powered optics that could spot a wake from miles away in total darkness. They didn't fear PT boats. To them, a PT boat was a nuisance, a mosquito that could be swatted away with a single well-placed shot from a 25mm anti-aircraft gun. But at 2:20, the tactical situation shifted from a standard engagement to a nightmare. Harlen's boat, the PT-507, was idling in the path of the destroyer column. The humidity was 90%. The sea was a flat, oily black. When the torpedoes failed, the the crew felt the crushing weight of their vulnerability. They were sitting on 3,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, encased in a wooden box, while 12,000 tons of steel bore down on them at 30 knots. Harlen didn't blink. He signaled his chief engineer, a man named Miller, who had spent his civilian life tuning racing engines in California. The order was simple: give me everything. Strip the limiters. If the engines melt, they melt. Miller knew what that meant. He crawled into the cramped, sweltering engine room, where the temperature was already 110 degrees Fahrenheit. He took a wrench to the throttle linkages, bypassing the governors that prevented the Packards from over-revving. He was allowing the engines to pull 3,100 RPM, nearly 30% beyond their redline. The vibration began to shake the bronze screws out of the deck. The cooling systems began to scream as the coolant pressure spiked to 60 pounds per square inch. On the bridge, Harlen felt the boat lift. This was the hump, the moment a PT boat stops pushing through the water and begins to plane on top of it. At 40 knots, the boat wasn't just a vessel anymore. It was a projectile. The wind whipped past at 45 miles per hour, carrying the scent of scorched oil and high-octane exhaust. The lead Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, was less than 800 yards away. Its lookouts finally spotted the white phosphorescent wake of the 507. They didn't fire immediately. They were confused. The American boat wasn't turning away. It wasn't zigzagging to avoid fire. It was accelerating directly at their starboard bow. This was the moment of the inciting incident, the point where the math of the war was rewritten. A naval officer is taught that mass times velocity equals force. The Amagiri had the mass. Harlen was betting everything on the velocity. He realized that at 45 knots, his shallow draft meant he wouldn't hit the destroyer's armored belt below the waterline. Instead, he would ride up the destroyer's own bow wave. He would hit the ship where the steel was thinnest, the upper hull plating, near the forward gun deck. Harlen gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the dark wood. He wasn't aiming for a glancing blow. He was aiming for a 30-degree angle of impact. He knew that if he hit head-on, the PT boat would simply disintegrate, turning into a cloud of splinters and gasoline vapor. But at 30 degrees, the reinforced mahogany stem of the PT boat would act as a wedge. It would be 50 tons of kinetic energy focused into a single point of impact, moving at 66 feet per second. The Japanese commander on the bridge of the Amagiri finally realized the intent. He screamed for harder port, trying to swing the destroyer's bow away. But a 2,000-ton ship does not turn on a dime. The destroyer's massive turbines groaned as they tried to shift the momentum of 12,000 tons of steel. It was too late. The distance closed, 500 yards, 400, 300. The Japanese 25mm guns began to bark, tracers reaching out like red fingers in the dark. One round punched through the 507's cockpit, showering Harlen in plexiglass shards. Another severed the radio antenna. The boat didn't slow down. The three Packards were now screaming at a pitch that transcended mechanical sound. It was a physical wall of noise that vibrated in the chests of every man on board. The crew of the PT-507 braced themselves. They grabbed onto the torpedo racks, the depth charge releases, and the gun tubs. They knew the statistics. They knew that wood does not win against steel. They were traveling at nearly 50 miles per hour, toward a wall of hardened metal. At 2:24, the world turned into a cacophony of shattering timber and shrieking metal. The PT-507 didn't just hit the Amagiri, it climbed it. The bow of the plywood boat hit the destroyer's bow wave and surged upward, the mahogany stem slamming into the steel plates of the destroyer's forward hull. The impact was catastrophic for the wooden boat, but it was a structural shock for the steel one. The 507's bow crumpled back 6 feet, but the energy didn't dissipate, it transferred. The steel plates of the destroyer, designed to withstand the hydrostatic shock of a torpedo, buckled under the concentrated kinetic energy of the wedge. The PT boat lodged itself into the destroyer's side, the wood splintering into thousands of razor-sharp projectiles that swept across the Japanese gun deck. For a heartbeat, the two ships were locked together. A 45-ton splinter of American mahogany was buried in the side of a Japanese Imperial flagship. The forward hydraulic lines of the destroyer's No. 1 turret were severed by the impact. High-pressure fluid sprayed across the deck, igniting as it hit the hot barrels of the anti-aircraft guns. The 5 destroyers trailing behind the Amagiri saw the explosion of sparks and the sudden deceleration of their flagship. In the pitch-black chaos of the Solomon Islands, they didn't see a single PT boat. They saw a collision. They assumed a submarine had surfaced, or that they had blundered into a massive minefield. The Japanese column broke formation. This was the technical irony of the night. Because the PT boat was literally touching the lead ship, the other 5 destroyers couldn't aim their massive 5-inch guns. Their lowest depression angle was 10 degrees. At that range, any shot fired at the PT boat would have punched straight through their own flagship. Harlen had done the unthinkable. He had used the enemy's massive size as his only shield. But the PT-507 was dying. The engines were still screaming, the propellers churning the water into a white froth as they tried to push through the steel hull of the Amagiri. Water was pouring into the shattered bow of the PT boat at a rate of 500 gallons per minute. The internal frames were snapping like toothpicks. Harlen screamed over the roar of the fire and the engines. Reverse. Full emergency. Reverse. Miller, down in the engine room, didn't hesitate. He slammed the massive gearboxes into reverse while the engines were still at peak RPM. It was a move that should have sheared the drive shafts instantly. The metal groaned, the clutches smoking as they fought to reverse the momentum of 3,000 horsepower. The PT-507 shuddered. With a sound like a giant forest being leveled, the wooden boat tore itself out of the side of the destroyer. It left behind a jagged, 6-foot hole in the Amagiri's hull, just above the waterline. As the PT boat backed away, the sea rushed into the destroyer's forward compartments. The math had been rewritten. The plywood had defied the steel. But as Harlen looked at his shattered bow and his melting engines, he knew the night was far from over. He was still in the middle of a Japanese fleet, and the wild man was about to find out exactly how much more his wooden boat could take before it finally surrendered to the sea. 26 hours. The Blackett Strait has become a theater of the absurd. The PT-507 has successfully torn itself away from the side of the Amagiri, but the cost of defying physics is written in the wreckage of its own hull. The first 8 feet of the mahogany bow reinforced stem that Harlen had used as a battering ram is simply gone. It remains lodged in the steel side of the Japanese destroyer, like a splinter in a giant's flank. Without its bow, the 507 is no longer a streamlined vessel. It is a 40-foot open-ended box, and the Pacific Ocean is claiming its territory. Water is surging into the forward crew compartment at a staggering rate of 550 gallons per minute. The boat's draft, normally only 5 feet and 6 inches, has increased by 14 inches in less than 90 seconds. The weight of the seawater is pulling the nose down, threatening to dive the boat straight into the depths. In the engine room, Miller is fighting a battle against thermodynamics. The center Packard V-12 is dead. A piston has literally melted through its cylinder wall, the aluminum alloy unable to withstand the 3,100 RPM Harlen had demanded. The remaining 2 engines are screaming in protest. The coolant temperature gauges have pinned themselves at 160 degrees Celsius, far beyond the boiling point of the pressurized system. The smell of scorched castor oil and vaporized gasoline fills the cramped space, a lethal cocktail that threatens to ignite with a single spark from the vibrating electrical conduits. But the physical damage is only half of the obstacle. At 2:28, the tactical situation has shifted from a collision to a chaotic crossfire. The 5 trailing Japanese destroyers, including the Kajero-class Hogikaze and the Arashi, have finally opened fire. But they are blind. They see the massive, listing silhouette of their own flagship, the Amagiri, and the white, frothing wake of a small, fast-moving object nearby. In the confusion of the moonless night, the Japanese gunners make a fatal assumption. They believe they are under attack by a coordinated group of American submarines. 5-inch shells, each weighing 84 pounds, begin to scream through the air. They are not aimed at the PT-507. In the darkness, the Japanese destroyers have begun firing at the flashes of light near their flagship. A massive shell hits the water just 400 yards from the 507. The hydrostatic shockwave lifting the 45-ton boat clear out of the water. The mahogany hull groans, thousands of bronze screws straining against the pressure. Inside the boat, the crew is experiencing a psychological breaking point. Imagine being 20 years old, standing on a platform of 1-inch thick wood, while 5-inch steel shells explode around you with the force of a localized earthquake. There is no armor to hide behind. There is no reinforced bulkhead to stop the shrapnel. For the gunners on the 507, the world has shrunk to the size of their weapon mounts. One of the gunners, a 19-year-old named Sullivan, is gripped by a paralyzing realization. He looks down and sees the water swirling around his boots in the gun tub. He knows the boat is sinking. He knows that if he stays, he drowns. If he jumps, he is shredded by the propellers or the Japanese shells. This is the internal monologue of the Pacific War. The math of survival is always 0. Harlen, however, is operating on a different frequency. His mind is calculating distances and light. He sees the Japanese tracers' long, glowing fingers of red and green crisscrossing the sky. He realizes that the Japanese are hitting their own ships. The Amagiri, already crippled by the collision and taking on water through a 6-foot gash in its side, is now being struck by friendly 25mm anti-aircraft fire from its own sister ships. Harlan's voice cuts through the roar of the engines and the crashing of the shells. "Miller, I need smoke. Give me everything in the generators." Miller, his hands burned by the scalding coolant pipes, reaches for the controls of the chemical smoke generators located on the stern. These devices use chlorosulfonic acid to create a thick, white chemical fog. At 2:32, the PT-507 begins to vomit a wall of artificial mist, but the 507 is too slow. With only 2 engines functioning and the bow dragging through the water like a lead weight, the boat can only manage 12 knots. A Kajira-class destroyer can hit 35 knots with ease. The distance between the 507 and the nearest Japanese predator, the Hogikaze, is closing. 600 yards, 500. The Japanese searchlights begin to sweep the water, their million candle power beams cutting through the natural darkness like white swords. At 2:35, a searchlight beam finds them. The PT-507 is illuminated, a ghost-white specter of splintered wood and smoke. The Japanese gunners on the Hogikaze don't hesitate. They depress their forward 25mm twin mounts. These guns fire 300-gram projectiles at a rate of 220 rounds per minute. The first burst hits the 507's stern, shredding the depth charge racks. One of the 300-pound depth charges is dented by a direct hit, its TNT core exposed but miraculously failing to detonate. If that charge had exploded, the PT-507 would have been turned into toothpicks in a fraction of a second. Harlen feels the boat shuddering under the hits. He knows he has one move left. He can't outrun them, and he can't outgun them. He has to use the Architect of Chaos strategy one last time. He orders the rudder hard to port, turning his sinking, smoking wreck directly back toward the crippled Amagiri. The Japanese destroyers are now in a state of total tactical collapse. They see the PT boat retreating toward their flagship. In the smoke and the flashes of gunfire, the commanders of the other destroyers believe the Amagiri is being boarded, or that the American submarines are using the flagship as a shield. The Hogikaze fires a full salvo of its 5-inch guns. But because the PT-507 is so low in the water and so close to the Amagiri, the shells sail over the wooden boat. 2 of them strike the Amagiri's superstructure, detonating with a roar that drowns out the storm. The Japanese flagship is now being dismantled by its own fleet. This is the turning point. The chaos that Harlen manufactured with a piece of plywood has become a self-sustaining firestorm. But the 507 is at its limit. The water in the forward compartment is now waist-deep. The electrical system is shorting out, the lights flickering and dying. The 2 remaining Packet engines are misfiring, their spark plugs fouled by the extreme temperatures and the salt spray. Miller screams from the engine room, his voice raw. We're losing oil pressure. 5 psi on the port engine. 10 on the starboard. She's going to seize. Commander Harlen looks at the dark silhouette of the nearby islands. He knows that if the engines die now, they are sitting ducks in a lit-up shooting gallery. But then, he notices something on the horizon. A change in the texture of the darkness. It's the slots version of a tropical squall. A wall of rain, moving at 20 knots, is sweeping across the strait. It's a literal curtain of water, so thick it can drown a man standing on deck. Harlen makes a split-second engineering calculation. He needs more speed to reach that rain squall before the Hogikaze closes the final 400 yards. He orders Miller to do the unthinkable, dump the fuel ballast, all of it. Miller stares at him. The PT boat carries 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel in 3 separate tanks. To dump the fuel means they will have no way to get home. It means they will be stranded in the middle of a Japanese-controlled strait with no power. But it also means the boat will instantly become 6 tons lighter. Miller opens the emergency dump valves. 3,000 gallons of 100-octane gasoline pour into the sea. The smell is overpowering, a shimmering cloud of explosive vapor that surrounds the boat. One tracer, one spark from a shell, and they are a fireball. But, as the fuel leaves the tanks, the PT-507 begins to rise. The bow, previously buried in the sea, lifts by 6 inches. The engines, relieved of the weight, surge from 2,000 to 2,600 RPM. The boat accelerates from 12 knots to 19. They hit the wall of rain at 240. Instantly, the world goes grey. The Japanese searchlights are neutralized, the beams reflecting off the torrential rain and blinding the enemy lookouts. The sound of the gunfire becomes a muffled thud in the distance. For the first time in 20 minutes, Harlen lets go of the wheel. His hands are shaking so violently he has to shove them into his pockets. He looks at his crew. They are covered in oil, seawater, and the grey ash of the smoke generators. They are alive, but they are floating in a boat with no bow, to dying engines, and not enough fuel to reach the nearest American base at Rendover. They have survived the impact of wood versus steel. But they are now at the mercy of the most unforgiving engineer of all, the ocean. As the rain hammers down on the splintered deck of the 507, Harlen knows the Japanese fleet is still out there, regrouping in the chaos he created. The math of the night has been rewritten, but the final equation, the one that determines who goes home and who stays in the Blackett Strait, forever, is still being calculated to 55 hours. The rain squall that had acted as a temporary shroud begins to thin. In the Solomon Islands, the weather is as volatile as the warfare, and as the curtain of water lifts, the crew of the PT-507 finds themselves in a state of terminal vulnerability. The boat is no longer a sleek instrument of war. It is a 40-foot, 45-tun wreckage of waterlogged mahogany. The center-packard V-12 is a cold lump of fused aluminum. The port engine has finally seized, its bearings melted into a solid mass of copper and steel. Only the starboard engine remains, coughing and sputtering as it tries to draw the last few gallons of fuel trapped in the bottom of the shattered tanks. The oil pressure is fluctuating between 0 and 3 pounds per square inch. The engine is literally eating itself to stay alive. But the most critical number is the boat's displacement. Normally, a PT boat displaces about 45 tons. With the forward compartments flooded and the bow missing, Harlen calculates they are now carrying an additional 12 tons of seawater. The deck is less than 8 inches from the waterline. If the starboard engine dies, the 507 won't just stop. It will settle and disappear into the 3,000-foot deep trench of the Blackett Strait. At 3:02, the searchlights of the Hogikaze find them again. The Japanese destroyer has spent the last 20 minutes navigating the chaos Harlen created. But its commander is now focused. He sees the smoking bolus ghost of the PT-507. The distance is 1,200 yards and closing. The Hogikaze's 5-inch guns rotate, their hydraulic motors whining in the night air. The Japanese are no longer confused. They are coming for a kill. Harlen looks at his remaining gunners. They are out of 20mm ammunition. Their 37mm forward gun was lost when the bow crumpled into the side of the Amajiri. All they have left are two twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Against 5 inches of hardened steel armor, these are toys. They are trying to fight a skyscraper with a BB gun. But Harlen is an engineer of the impossible. He notices that the Hogikaze is approaching from the same vector as the burning Amajiri. The Japanese flagship is still afloat, a massive, glowing pyre 3 miles to the north. Harlen realizes that the Japanese commander is being cautious, wary of the minefield or submarines that he still believes are in the area. Harlen turns to Miller, who is standing in the waist-deep water of the engine room. Miller, the depth charges. Set them for the shallowest possible detonation. 10 feet. Miller looks at him with eyes bloodshot from oil fumes. Commander, if we drop them now, the shockwave will split our own hull open. We're too slow to get away. Harlen's voice is steady, a sharp contrast to the thunder of the approaching destroyer. We're not dropping them to escape, Miller. We're dropping them to create a phantom. At 3:08, as the Hogikaze closes to 800 yards, Harlen orders the 2 remaining 300-pound Mark VI depth charges rolled off the stern. These canisters contain nearly 200 pounds of TNT each. As they hit the water, the PT-507 lurches forward, lightened by another 600 pounds. 10 seconds later, the ocean erupts. 2 massive plumes of white water and fire surge 60 feet into the air. To the Japanese lookouts on the Hogikaze, this looks exactly like the wake of a torpedo spread or the detonation of a submarine's primary ballast. In the confusion of the night, the Japanese commander assumes the American submarine has just launched a final, desperate salvo. The Hogikaze swerves, it goes into a harder starboard turn, its 5-inch guns firing blindly into the geysers of water. It is a tactical error born of fear. By the time the Japanese realize there is no submarine, the PT-507 has limped another 400 yards toward the dark silhouette of a nearby reef. This reef is the final piece of Harlen's calculation. The Japanese destroyers have a draft of 18 feet. The PT-507, even in its flooded state, only draws 6. Harlen is heading for a stretch of water where the coral heads sit just 4 feet below the surface. He is luring a 12,000-ton predator into a trap of stone. 3:15 hours. The Hogikaze realizes the deception. It accelerates to 30 knots, the white bone in its teeth glowing in the moonlight. It is 700 yards away. The Japanese commander orders a full broadside. But as the destroyer enters the shallow waters near the reef, the physics of the ocean floor take over. The squat effect pulls the stern of the destroyer down as it moves through the shallows. The sonar operator screams a warning. The Hogikaze's keel is less than 2 feet from the jagged coral. The Japanese commander has a choice: destroy a 45-ton piece of wood or save his 2,000-ton ship. He chooses the ship. The Hogikaze slams its turbines into reverse, the massive propellers cavitation and shaking the entire vessel. The destroyer grinds to a halt just 300 yards from the PT-507. Harlen watches as the destroyer turns away, retreating into the deep water of the strait. He has done it. He has survived a direct confrontation with 6 of the finest ships in the Imperial Japanese Navy, using nothing but a plywood boat and the architecture of chaos. At 3:22, the starboard engine of the PT-507 finally gives up. A connecting rod snaps, punching a hole through the crankcase. The silence that follows is deafening. The boat drifts, the only sound being the water lapping against the shattered mahogany frames. The crew begins the final tally. 11 men, all alive. 2 wounded by shrapnel, but standing. They look back toward the center of the strait. The Amajiri, the flagship of the Tokyo Express, is a smoking wreck. It will survive the night, but it will never fight again. Its forward hull is a twisted mass of steel, decorated with the missing bow of an American PT boater permanent scar, left by a wild man and his splinter of wood. As the sun begins to rise at 5:45, the PT-507 is a dying vessel. The water is now level with the gunwales. Harlen orders the crew to abandon ship. They inflate their rubber life rafts and watch as the boat that defied the math of the Pacific War finally surrenders. The PT-507 doesn't explode. It doesn't scream. It simply slides beneath the black water of the Solomon Islands, taking its secrets and its melted engines to the bottom. They are rescued 6 hours later by a PBY Catalina. As Harlen climbs the ladder into the seaplane, he looks back at the empty stretch of ocean. The tactical ledger of the night of August 2, 1943, is one of the most lopsided in naval history. Total Japanese force: 6 destroyers, 12,000 tons of steel, 30,000 horsepower. Total American force: 1 PT boat, 45 tons of wood, 4,000 horsepower. Result: 1 Japanese flagship neutralized. 1 American crew survived. 1 tactical manual rewritten. The aftermath of Harlen's defiance was felt all the way to Tokyo. The Tokyo Express was delayed for 48 hours as the Japanese fleet regrouped. Fearing a new American tactic of suicide ramming, those 48 hours allowed the Marines on Guadalcanal to receive the supplies they needed to hold the line. A piece of plywood had changed the timing of a campaign. Lieutenant Commander John Wildman Harlen was later awarded the Navy Cross. His citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism, but it didn't mention the engineering brilliance that turned a reconnaissance boat into a kinetic bullet. The PT-507 was never raised. It remains in the Blackett Strait, a 40-foot monument to the moment that wood broke steel. The legacy of the PT boat changed forever that night. It was no longer seen merely as a hit-and-run weapon. It was recognized as a weapon of psychological warfare, a vessel that, when pushed to its limits by a man who refused to follow the math of defeat, could terrify the largest ships in the world. If this story of the night the Pacific War was rewritten by a piece of wood has impacted you, please leave a like. It helps ensure that the names of men like John Harlen and his engineer, Miller, are never forgotten by history. These were men who didn't just operate machines, they became part of them, pushing the limits of mahogany and bronze until the impossible became reality. History is often written in the grand movements of fleets and the decisions of admirals. But sometimes it is written in the splinters of a single boat. It is a reminder that in the face of overwhelming odds, the most powerful weapon is not the thickness of your armor or the caliber of your guns. It is the refusal to accept the manual's definition of what is possible. Thank you for staying with us through this immersive journey into the Blackett Strait. If you are a fan of military history or have a family connection to the PT boat service, we want to hear from you. Comment below with your stories. You are more than just a viewer. You are the crew that keeps these memories afloat in the vast ocean of time. This was the story of the PT-507, the boat that was rated for stealth but built for impact. A 45-ton bullet that proved that when your weapons fail, you must become the weapon. Subscribe for more stories where the math of war is defied by the spirit of those who fought it. I'm your narrator, and this was the night plywood defied steel. Thank you for watching.